Hello, my name is Dr. Dan Wedding, and this is DrWedding, VB13, Introduction to 1D Arrays. If you have ever taken a programming class and you think using an array is confusing, don't panic. If you have been told by others that arrays are difficult and confusing, ignore them. By the end of this video, you should find arrays easy to understand and use. An array is just a variable like we have been using so far. The only difference is a variable can hold one value and an array can hold more than one value. I have been using variables in this series so far. On the right is a representation of a variable named int_fred. This variable is just a storage container that can hold a specific piece of data. In this example, it is an integer. If you put a value in the variable, it will save the value. If you put a new value in the variable, the old value is erased to make room for the new value. A variable can only hold one value at a time. To the right is a representation of an array named int_array_joe. Think of an array like a hotel. The name of the hotel is int_array_joe, and this hotel has 5 rooms. Each room has a number on the door so you can find the information you are looking for. The rooms are called array elements, and the number on the door is called the index. Each room is exactly the same, and each room can hold one value. An array can't mix and match different variable types in the same array. When you access an element in an array, you must include the index. In other words, when you try to find information in the hotel, you must include the room number. How do you declare an array in VB? It's similar to the way you declare a variable. Below, int_fred is being declared as an integer variable. The only difference between a variable and an array is you add an index next to the array name when you declare it. The index is what makes this variable an array. VB is different from every other language I have ever used when it comes to arrays. I need to show you how arrays are declared in other languages so you can understand how VB is different. When you declare an array in C, C++, Java, and other similar languages, you would use the command below. The 5 inside the square brackets means there are 5 elements. In this language, the elements are indexed starting at 0. So, the indexes are 0 through 4. If you try to access an element with the index 5, you will crash the program because element 5 does not exist. When you declare an array in FORTRAN, you would use the command below. Just like before, the 5 inside the parentheses means there are 5 elements. When generating an array in FORTRAN, MATLAB, R, COBOL, and others, the indexing starts at 1, so the indexes are 1 through 5. If you try to access an element with the index 6, you will crash the program because element 6 does not exist. How do you declare an array in VB? It's similar to the way you declare a variable. Below, int_fred is being declared as an integer variable. The only difference between a variable and an array is you add an index next to the array name when you declare it. The index is what makes this variable an array. Now for the odd part. Visual Basic is different than all other languages I have used because when you ask for 5 elements, it gives you 6. VB indexes from 0, but it also has an extra element at the end. When you see the declaration below, you will generate the array on the right side of the screen. Some programmers who have learned other programming languages before VB will just ignore one element. Programmers who learned indexing from 1 will use 5 elements that are indexed from 1 to 5 and ignore element 0. Programmers who learned indexing from 0 will use 5 elements that are indexed from 0 to 4 and ignore element 5. I admit it, I am guilty of this. I often index from 0 and ignore the last element. But it can lead to some troubles when using some of the built-in methods. So for VB, it is best to use the entire array. If you are seeing a 1D, 2D, or any other number followed by a D in front of the array, you may be wondering what that means. 1D array stands for one-dimensional array. This video is covering the 1D array. It is just a list, and you only need one index, the row, to access the correct information. 2D array stands for two-dimensional array. This video does not cover the 2D array. The 2D array is like a checkerboard, and you need two indexes, the row and the column in that order, to access the correct information. 3D array stands for three-dimensional array. This video does not cover the 3D array. The 3D array is like a Rubik's Cube or a stack of checkerboards, and you need 3 indexes, the row, the column, and the layer, in that order, to access the correct information. Speaking of the Rubik's Cube, if you want to learn how to solve the Rubik's Cube, please watch DrWedding RCO1, RCO2, and RCO3. We can add more and more dimensions to an array. It gets harder and harder to imagine what they look like, however, it can be done. For example, a 4D array would be a row of cubes. A 5D array would be a checkerboard with a cube on each square. A 6D array would be a stack of checkerboards with a Rubik's Cube on each square. Did I mention DrWedding RCO1, RCO2, and RCO3? Arrays are used to hold a lot of data that is all alike, such as grades in a class, serial numbers of cars, payments made to a bank, and so on. An array is powerful when it is inside of a loop and the loop index matches the array index. An array is a variable that has a number as part of its name. This lets you repeat a task inside of a loop and use the loop to move through the array by changing the index. Assume you want to add up all the values in a list. If you had 20 single variables, the command would be very long. An example is shown below. An array is powerful because part of the name of the array is a number. This number can be controlled by a loop. Remember, an array is powerful when it is inside of a loop and the loop index matches the array index. So adding up 20 numbers, 200 numbers, or 2,000 numbers is the same. An example of adding 20 numbers is shown below. You can see that the array named myArray is inside of the loop. You can also see that the loop index, the I that is controlling the loop, matches the array index, the I between the parentheses. This will be a common theme when using an array. Now that you have a basic understanding of how an array works, let's do some examples. I've opened up a new project named VB13 and generated a new form. Let's start by creating an array and filling it with random values. I'm going to create a global array. I'm going to make this array global because it's going to be used by more than one subroutine. This array has 11 values. This is unlike any other programming language. In any other programming language, this would be a 10-element array. The elements would be 0 through 9 or 1 through 10, depending on the programming language. However, Visual Basic is different. It makes this an 11-element array. The elements are 0 through 10. I'm going to fill this array up with random values, so I'm going to have to go to form load and randomize the random number generator. Next, I'm going to fill the array with random values. It really doesn't matter what the number is. I'm just filling up the array. I'm going to take this value and set it equal to the first value of the array. Because this is an array, we have to tell the computer which element we want to deal with. In this example, we're dealing with array element 0, and it's going to get the answer to this random equation. In the introduction, I stated an array is powerful when it's inside of a loop and the loop index matches the array index. So let's do that with this equation. We'll put it inside of a loop. Now that I've put the equation inside of a loop, I have to make the loop index match the array index. The loop index is I, so I can make the array index I. When the for loop starts at 0, I'll be filling in element 0 of the array. When I is incremented to 1, I'll fill in array element 1. When it goes to 2, I'll be filling array 2, and so on. I've made this loop go from 0 to 9, 10 elements. I'm skipping element number 10. I'm doing that on purpose. I'm going to demonstrate why in a little bit. Now that the array is filled, let's print it to the text box. Just like I did before, I'm going to write a single line of code. This is what I want to have happen to every element of the array. In this case, I want to print the information to the screen, put it inside of a loop, and make the loop index match the array index. I've put the line inside a loop. Now I'm going to make the loop index match the array index. I used append text so I wouldn't lose the information on the text box. However, if I run this program over and over and over again, all of the data is going to be mashed together on the screen. So I'm going to clear the text box before I start this loop. Let's run the program and see what happens. Every time I press fill the array is getting a new set of random numbers. Now that our program is loading the array with random values, let's investigate some of the methods. Methods are just some pre-written programs that can be applied to the array. We'll demonstrate some of these methods in the Get Info button. First, I'm going to declare some local variables. I've declared an integer called int length and 3 doubles, one for the max, one for the min, and one for the sum. I'm going to move this up a little bit to make some room. And now we can apply some of these methods. The first method is the length method. It's going to return the length, or how many elements are in the array. These pre-written methods are operating on the entire array. So these methods don't use the index. The command is int length equals the array name DBL myArray dot. At this point you can see the methods in a drop-down, and the first one is length. The next method we're going to use is the max method. It returns the largest value in the array. We'll then get the minimum value, and lastly, the sum. After these values are loaded into the variables, let's print out the variables and see what they return. Let's run the program and see what happens. I'm going to run the Get Info button first. At this point, the array is filled with zeros, and we see that the length is 11, not 10, that the maximum value is 0, the minimum value is 0, and the sum of the entire array is 0. If I fill the array with random values, and then run the Get Info button a second time, you can see that the max value is 47.25, which is correct, but we can see that the minimum value is 0, and that is incorrect. 0 is not in this list. The sum is correct. We can verify that just by highlighting this column, copying it, putting it into Excel, and summing up the column. The only question you should be asking yourself is, why is minimum value 0? And the answer is, because there's an 11th value here. We've been ignoring it. We have been pretending it does not exist. But it does. So when minimum runs, it's going to look through the entire array, including the one we are ignoring, which happens to be 0. Let's make the minimum work with the method. To do that, all we need to do is shorten the length of the array by 1. So our array length is 10. That's easy enough to do. We just go up to the declaration and make this 9. So we get 10. We run the program. Now when we fill the array and get the information, our minimum value will be the minimum value in the list. You'll also see that the length has now changed to 10. Although these methods are convenient, there are some drawbacks. One drawback was already highlighted. If you're not using all of the elements of the array, min and max may not give you the correct answer. The second drawback is, if you're trying to learn how to use an array, having a pre-done method that does all the work for you is not very helpful. Therefore, I'm going to replace min, max, and sum with the code that actually does these tasks. Let's start with max. When finding the max or the min in an array, you start with the first value of the array. Then you step through the array one element at a time, each time making a comparison. And if you find a larger value, that becomes your new max value. At the end of the array, you will have the maximum value. So, we start with the first element of the array. A common error made by beginners is they set the max value or the min value to 0 before they start the loop. This is incorrect. By setting it to 0, you've actually introduced a value that may or may not be in the list. For example, let's say you're looking for the maximum value in the list. However, every value is negative. If you start max value at 0, it will be the highest value even though 0 is not in the list. This is exactly what happened when I used the min method and I wasn't using the last element of the array. It found a 0 in the array that wasn't part of my data set. So keep in mind, you don't set the value to 0, you set it to element 0 of the array. Next, we're going to write a for loop. However, we're going to have to go to the top and get a local variable I as the loop index. Because the 0 element has already been moved into double max, we don't need to start at element 0. We're going to start at element 1 and go to the end. Inside this for loop, we're going to have to look at each element and compare it to double max. And if the array element is larger than double max, then that will be the new max value. The same logic can be applied to the minimum value. The only difference is we're going to change what we're comparing. Instead of double my array being larger than double max, it'll be less than min. The summation works in a very similar way. However, if we're starting with a summation, we should assume it starts at 0. Next, we're going to generate a for loop. Inside the loop, double sum is going to equal double sum plus the array element. Let's clean this up a bit. Let's run this program and see what happens. If I run the information button with the array defaulting at 0, you'll see that the max, the min, and the sum will all be 0. If I fill the array with values and then hit information, we can see that the maximum value is 47.8, and that is the maximum value in that list. The smallest value is 7.2, and that is the smallest value in the list. And the sum is 337. If you were to add up all the values in this column, you might see that it's off by a decimal point or two. The reason for this is we're only printing 2 decimal points. And when the program is performing the math, it's using all of the decimal points. Understanding how to manipulate an array is a very important skill. Even though these 3 pieces of code already have methods written that will do the same thing, you may be required to do something to an array that doesn't have a method. Let's add another button to the form, and let's open up the code behind this button. I'm going to write a few quick pieces of code to demonstrate what can be done with an array. This segment of code will print the array backwards. All I did was put the array inside of a loop and made the loop index match the array index. However, the loop is going from 9 to 0 with a step size of -1. Let's see what happens when I run this program. First, I'm going to fill the array, then I'm going to reverse the array. I might have a need to print out only values greater than 20. This is pretty easy to do. You would do it just like you would do it with a variable by putting a print statement inside of an if block. However, because this is an array, I'll put that if block inside of a loop and make the loop index match the array index. Let's run this program. First, I fill the array, then I'm going to reverse it and print values that are only larger than 20. Finally, let's take this array, multiply it by -1, and store it in another array in reverse order. First, I needed to add a second array. Next, I multiplied the value of the array by -1. The array is inside of a loop, and the loop index is matching the array index. But because I wanted to reverse the order, I put an equation between the parentheses. The equation is 9 minus I. When I is 0, double my array element 0 is multiplied by -1. It's stored in double flip at 9 minus 0, which is 9. So element 0 of my array is going into element 9 of the flipped array. When I goes to 1, my double array element 1 is multiplied by -1 and stored in 9 minus 1, or 8. 2 will go into 7, 3 will go into 6, and so on. After double flip is filled, it's printed in the second for loop. Let's run this program and see what happens. I'm going to fill the array, then I'm going to run the do something button, And as you can see, the array is in reverse order and negative. I hope this video has emphasized the fact that most of the time when you're going to be using an array, it will be inside of a loop, and the loop index will match the array index. In review, you declare an array in Visual Basic just like you declare a variable. The only difference is there's an index. The index is what makes this variable an array, and it lets the compiler know how many elements are in the array. Visual Basic starts indexing at 0. Visual Basic is different than most languages because when you ask for 5 elements, it gives you 6 elements. Sometimes, programmers who know how to program in other languages may ignore one of the array elements. They may do this because they're used to programming that way, or they may not be aware there is an extra array element in Visual Basic. Whatever the reason, this may cause problems when using array methods such as max and min, because there is a 0 hanging around at the end of the array. Methods are pre-written code segments that you can use on an array. When using the methods listed below, you do not need to include the index. When you are not using a method, you will need to include the index. An array is a variable that has a number as part of its name. This lets you repeat a task inside of a loop and use the loop to move through the array by changing the index. An array is powerful when it is inside of a loop and the loop index matches the array index. Below are some examples of how to use an array inside of a loop. Assume the array has 10 elements, indexed 0 through 9. If you find these videos useful, please like and subscribe. It is the only way I can continue to make these videos.